In the summer of 1941, World War II would enter one of its most brutal chapters. When launching Operation Barbarossa, the Axis invasion of the Soviet Union, Germany had numerous motives, ranging from economic, ideological, and social motives. Germany needed to seize Soviet wheat and oil fields to fuel their war machine against Britain. They desired to eliminate the Soviet government, which in their eyes was controlled by Jewish communists. They desired to expel or eliminate the Slavic and Jewish populations in Europe and replace them with Germans. The resulting campaign would trigger the largest tank battle in history, not Kursk, but rather the Battle of Brody. Fighting would take place around the cities of Brody, Dubno, Rovno, and Lutsk. On June 22nd, the German 1st Panzer Army, under the command of Ewald Kleist, advanced into Ukraine around the town of Volodymyr. His forces struck at the intersection point of the Soviet 5th and 6th armies along a 40-kilometer front. This brilliant tactical move cut the communication and transportation lines between the two Soviet armies, dashing the possibility of a coordinated Soviet response. Kleist's army was tasked with seizing western Ukraine. His first task was capturing the industrial and logistical center, the capital of Ukraine, Kiev. Kleist moved his forces on a southeastern trajectory, heading for the Black Sea coast to cut off any Soviets in southern Ukraine. The capture of numerous bridgeheads over the Dnieper River would also be critical to German success. This meant that the Soviet Fifth Army would bear the brunt of the German panzer attack. Soviet commanders in Moscow wanted an immediate counterattack into the southern part of German-occupied Poland. In fact, Stavka commanders expected Soviet forces to occupy the city of Lublin by June 24th, an advance of 80 kilometers in just 2 days. These goals were hopelessly unrealistic, and Soviet forces lacked the combat readiness and coordination necessary for a successful counterattack. General Mikhail Kirponos was forced to carry out the order. The resulting action would result in the largest tank engagement in history, the Battle of Brody. Soviet forces designated for the attack were spread out across western Ukraine and lacked the experience that German panzer crews had. Kirponos was provided with 5 mechanized corps, but their dispersed locations meant that he needed at least 3 days to organize them in one location. The strict timetable meant that a coordinated attack was impossible. Soviet forces would have to attack at different times in different places to meet his superiors' expectations on time. At this point in World War II, Soviet units were not in any position to attack. Soviet forces faced equipment shortages, significantly reducing the chances of a successful breakthrough. Units lacked trucks necessary for moving infantry and artillery, and tanks and anti-tank guns lacked armor-piercing ammunition. In addition, tank crews, for the most part, had to rely on outdated signal flags for communication rather than radios. Despite these initial disadvantages, the Soviets had a combined regional force of over 3,000 tanks. Most of these were light T-26 and BT tanks, which had thin armor and hailed from the 1930s. The Soviets had some modern, well-armored KVs and T-34s, but only in few numbers. The Germans, on the other hand, only had around 600 tanks. More problems quickly began to plague the Soviets, though. Neglected Soviet tanks faced numerous mechanical breakdowns. The German Air Force, which had already neutralized most of the Soviet planes in bombing runs, attacked Soviet columns with little resistance. The poor Soviet infrastructure and dusty terrain resulted in breakdowns on both sides. The first unit to encounter the Germans was the 19th Soviet Tank Division. Mechanical troubles and German air attacks had whittled the division down to something of regimental strength. Despite this, they pressed on with an attack. On the plus side, the Soviets mustered together about 12 KV-2 tanks, which were essentially the opposite of light BT tanks. They were slow, but had very thick armor and a powerful 152mm howitzer, which was capable of taking out any German tank. German tanks had few weapons capable of taking out a KV-2. In such few number, though, KV-2s had little impact on the battle, and skilled German crews often outmaneuvered them. Predictably, A 2-hour fight nearly destroyed the whole 19th Tank Division, and it was forced to fall back 15 kilometers west of Lutsk. Numerous Soviet commanders died, but the Germans took heavy casualties and were unable to reach Lutsk. More Soviet tank formations entered the region during the night of June 24th. The Soviet fuel situation was so bad that they had to siphon fuel out of disabled vehicles and put it in the ones that still worked. On the 24th, the Soviets had the greatest chance of success, although their attack would ultimately fail. The 8th and 15th Soviet Mechanized Corps advanced to the north of Brody, to the town of Berestechko, nearly encircling the Germans on the outskirts of Dubno. It was the strongest force the Soviets would assemble during the entire battle. Although battered by mechanical breakdowns and air attacks, the two corps had a combined strength of around 1,500 tanks, with about 250 T-34s and KV-1s. These tanks had superior armor to most German tanks of the time, and the Germans mostly relied on their 88mm cannons to destroy them. 75mm and 50mm guns could take them out if used correctly. The failure of this counterattack can be attributed to the ineffective Soviet doctrine. Unlike the Germans, who concentrated their tanks into one area, the Soviets dispersed their tanks along the whole front, reducing the total potential of concentrated firepower. Another thing going against the Soviets was how BT and T-26 tanks were easy prey. Most German tanks were Panzer IIs, and about a third of them were Panzer IIIs or Panzer IVs. The Panzer IV could take out T-34s from all sides, but the Panzer III could only reliably take out T-34s from the sides or rear. Accurate German gunners often aimed for vulnerable parts on Soviet tanks, like turret rings, tracks, and gun barrels. German tanks had a superior rate of fire, so they would often bombard enemy tanks in the hopes of hitting a vulnerable part. In addition, Soviet tankers often drove their vehicles on the most easily navigable routes in columns, which were vulnerable to German attacks. Finally, the Soviet usage of signal flags for battlefield communication rather than radios forced tanks to bunch up. When the command tank was knocked out, all coordination was lost. By the end of June 25th, German panzers had entered Lutsk with a flanking attack. The 22nd Soviet Mechanized Corps launched a desperate counterattack. They took heavy casualties but were able to stall the German advance. In the meantime, the 9th Mechanized Corps deployed 65 kilometers east of Lutsk in Rovno. From Lutsk, the Germans turned south to Brody and Dubno. The panic-stricken Soviets had low coordination and morale. On the 26th, the Germans tried to advance to Rovno but faced stubborn resistance and were unable to do so. At this point, the 19th Soviet Mechanized Corps launched a counterattack against the southern flank of the German attack, creating a 30-kilometer deep spearhead. In the afternoon, additional Soviet forces in the 43rd Tank Division attacked German forces around Dubno, but German panzers and anti-tank guns destroyed many Soviet tanks, most of which were light T-26 tanks. The Soviet counterattack had lost steam, and the Germans launched a massive attack to capture Dubno and pushed the Soviets back to Rovno by the end of June 26th. Although the German formations put up a robust defense against the 8th and 15th Soviet Corps, the Soviets, determined to attack, ordered the 9th Corps into battle on June 27th. General Konstantin Rokossovsky, a future field marshal, commanded this unit. His attack, with only 200 light tanks, had virtually no chance of reaching Dubno. His soldiers had low morale, gaps appeared in his front, and the Germans threatened to encircle his forces. The Soviets failed to push the Germans back. The Soviet counterattack had only served to delay the German advance, with high, unsustainable casualties, ultimately weakening the Soviet forces in the area. A common theme in the Battle of Brody was the number of Soviet commanders getting injured or killed. For instance, Major General Karpezo of the 15th Soviet Mechanized Corps was wounded. On June 28th, Germany had the strength to launch another massive panzer attack. Stavka authorized a retreat on the 29th, but it was too late by then. Retreating Soviet divisions were bombarded by German air attacks, and skirmishes whittled away at Soviet strength. German recon was able to pinpoint weak spots in the Soviet lines, and they used blitzkrieg tactics to encircle them. With 2 infantry and 2 tank divisions, the Germans surrounded 3 Soviet divisions of the 8th Mechanized Corps. 2 divisions were able to break out, but the 34th Tank Division was completely destroyed. The Germans destroyed many Soviet vehicles and captured the rest. Only about 1,000 Soviet soldiers successfully broke out. The Soviets lost over 10,000 men, 96 tanks, and over half of their artillery. The Germans pushed into the city of Rovno on June 28th, while facing stubborn Soviet resistance. They also blitzed to the city of Ostrog and crossed the Horn River. This maneuver threatened to cut off Soviet supply lines to the west side of the river, causing Soviet commanders to reluctantly pull their units east to avoid encirclement. With the advance to the river, German troops had been successful in the area of Brody. The last Soviet troops defending along the river were pushed back by July 2nd. In total, the Soviets had lost around 2,500 tanks, about 3/4 of their original total. The Soviets mostly lost light T-26 and BT tanks, so the remaining T-34s and KVs presented a threat to the Germans. The remaining Soviet units would put up a staunch defense against the Germans throughout the summer until finally being encircled in Kiev in September. The Battle of Brody was a victory for the Germans, with thousands of Soviet tanks, artillery pieces, and personnel being eliminated. The engagement by no means decided the outcome of the war, but it sent critical messages to both sides. The Germans learned that they needed to develop a new tank that could reliably eliminate medium and heavy Soviet tanks like KV-1s and T-34s. Their victory was another example of successful blitzkrieg tactics and encirclements. On the other hand, the Soviets realized that aspects of their military were critically outdated. More radios were installed in tanks, and production of medium and heavy tanks was increased. Still, for the most part, Soviet commanders remained constricted in their tactical flexibility on individual battlefields, and Stavka would be reluctant to retreat out of impending encirclements in later battles until 1942.